Welcome to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire, a series that digs deep into the life and works of one of the greatest novelists of all time. What connection can there be between Charles Dickens and the 19th century French philosopher Henry Bergson? That is what our guest today is asking. Hot off the press is her thesis, which she has just submitted at the University of Edinburgh, entitled
Dickens and Temporality, Reading Dickens Fiction Through the Lens of Bergson's Philosophy.
It's a huge topic that will send you, the listener, headlong through Bergsonian concepts of time, free will, memory, language, and laughter. Just reading those terms aloud by themselves, I think a picture already emerges of a strong bond between two giants of literature and philosophy. So, speaking and writing with flair in this episode is the inimitable Céleste Callen, who guides us through some tricky existential ideas with references to three of Dickens's Christmas books, A Christmas Carol, The Chimes, and The Haunted Man, and his novels, David Copperfield and Great Expectations. But before we invite Céleste into our chat, I just want to leave you with some impressions, which I will not try to explain, but I think they feel strongly relevant to our imminent conversation. First, Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway opens with the strike of Big Ben.
There, out it boomed. First a warning, musical. Then the hour, irrevocable. The leaden circles dissolved in the air.
Then, in Oscar Wilde's Lady Windermere's Fan, Lord Darlington makes a remark in favour of qualitative rather than quantitative perception, when he defines a cynic as
a man who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing.
Finally, in the play Copenhagen by Michael Frayn, the characters remark at one point,
What a curious sort of diary memory is. You open the pages, and all the neat headings and tidy jottings dissolve around you. The past becomes the present inside your head.
That was the wonderful Sophie Reynolds lending her voice there, and reading the Dickens excerpts now throughout this episode is the fantastic actor Peter Bray. It's time to welcome our guest. Céleste, welcome to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire. It's so great to have you here.
Hello, Dominic. It's wonderful. Thank you for having me.
Not at all. And you've sent me your thesis, which you've just submitted at Edinburgh University, which is about, well, would you tell us what it's about?
Yeah, so it's looking at Dickens's fiction through the lens of Henry Bergson's philosophy of subjective time. That's the main summary of it. Yeah.
That's amazing. For a long time, I've been quite obsessed with Dickens's use of time and time travel happening in his stories and all of that. So I've been wanting to do this episode for a long time. And so I'm glad to have met you to be able to have this conversation. But how did you narrow down your choices of books to look at? That must have been a really tough call for you.
Yeah, definitely. So for Bergson, I'm actually focusing on the first two books that he published. So he did publish more books, and it goes deeper and deeper after that as well. But I focused on the first two because it made more sense with Dickens, because obviously my PhD is in literature, so it focuses on Dickens's fiction. And it made sense because in his first two books, he talks about durée, so duration, and he really clearly summarizes what his philosophy is in those two first books. So the first one is called Time and Free Will, and the second book is Matter and Memory in English. Yeah, and so the second one really goes deeper into the idea of memory and the past and the present and the role that memory has in our temporal experience day to day. And so that's what I think resonated the most with Dickens. And then for choosing the Dickens books, I think it was really at first just an instinct. I really felt like the Christmas books represented a turning point in the way that he thought about time, obviously, which a lot of people would probably associate with time. When I first say Dickens and time, obviously they think about A Christmas Carol. But then the other ones that less people talk about that you know really well, obviously the Chimes and The Haunted Man. And then the later books, the first-person narratives, because for me that's where, when I was reading them, when I was studying my undergrad and everything, there was a module called Memory and Time, and we studied David Copperfield in depth in relation to that. And I really realized that these first-person narratives have really, there's much more to say about the way that Dickens creates that narrative voice that merges the past, the present, the future, that isn't just, a static past and an ongoing present.
Yeah, and from what I've understand of Bergson and reading your work, the subjective narrative is obviously a very key window to understanding durée or duration.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned duration. I think to a lot of listeners, we will think duration, how long does it take to listen to this episode? How long does it take to boil a kettle? But that's absolutely not what it is. So what I thought, if we could maybe carefully go through a little bit of a list of some of Bergson's key terms and try and understand it. I mean, just assume no knowledge. And for those that do know a little bit, maybe we can, I don't know, shine some more light on it and find other ways of seeing it. But which would be a good one to start? Is duration, durée?
Yeah, that's the most important.
Fine, that's the most important. So here's with durée then.
To summarize, durée, Bergson basically opposes a mathematical, linear, chronological way of seeing time. And so he wants to bring us back to the mind, our consciousness, our own internal subjective experience of time. And he says that that is central, really, to the way that we navigate the world. And so that's what he does in the first book. And durée specifically is that kind of interconnected aspect of time. So the fact that it's not just this linear, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. It's more of the past weaving into the present and states interconnected. He uses many different ways of explaining this. So he uses the example of a melody that's very interpenetrative. So it goes from the past to the present to the future. We're anticipating what is going to happen next already as we're speaking now. And we're also thinking about the immediate past at the same time. So it's this idea of, durée as really being in time. And the fact that the present is always already past. So we're always moving.
The primacy of subjective experience. So he's coming up against, at the end of the 19th century into the 20th century, science and empiricism and utilitarianism and all of those ideas of kind of, you got to be able to measure it. And whatever you're feeling inside doesn't mean anything. But he's saying, no, we are subjective beings. So anything that we choose to measure, we're still being, I guess, subjective. We're perceiving it in a subjective way.
Exactly. And then he complicates it even further, because then you would think...
I just thought we got that.
Yeah, but it is exactly that. It's exactly that. But then when you would think then, seeing that, you would think, oh, okay, so then it's only the subjective world and nothing else exists. But it's not that. He does then go on to say, no, the real world is obviously important and is there, and we are in that world and we are part of that world. And so he's not saying that the inner world is the only world, but it's just that, like you said, it's the most central part of it, and it connects the external with the internal through our consciousness. And so that's when he goes to matter and memory, and he says that actually matter and memory coincide continuously, because we're constantly interacting with the world, but also interacting with all our memories and our consciousness at the same time.
Yes. And another fact about him that I've picked up is that he was an excellent mathematician. So he's not making these arguments from the standpoint of someone that can't actually measure stuff. I think that line that you use, obviously in your thesis, Scrooge is one about, I will live in the past, the present, and the future, and that's Scrooge returning to his true self. So Bergson is arguing that clock time, the external time and measurements of it, can drive us away from our true selves, our natures, our busy timetables, and all of that.
Exactly. Yeah. He goes actually into more detail about that. He calls it the superficial self.
Right.
And it kind of goes with the idea, of a mechanical. He also goes into this idea of the mechanical man. So it goes with the idea of mathematical time. The fact that we want to structure our inner life the way that the external world is structured, and so that's why we think of time as linear. We need those timetables. We need everything that's structured in that way in order to exist and to function in this society that is driven by this structure. But then, obviously, it's completely different to what we experience internally. And that is the idea that we can't separate who we are now from who we were yesterday or who we will be tomorrow. Yeah, exactly. The past, present, and future.
Dickens obviously shows this with some of his characters, that if you try and separate yourself from your past and the child you were, you have problems. Or if you try and force yourself to stay in one place, try and halt time's advance, again, you have problems. But clock time, the limitations of clock time is that it's taking a piece out of time or duration, and that's not enough. So when you have the image of a clock and chimes and things, if you see 12 o'clock strike, 11 o'clock's gone. You can't have 12 o'clock without 11 o'clock. But in our experience from looking at the clock, we have no sense of 11 o'clock. It's only the present 12. Right.
He actually uses that example, what you just described.
Well, that's great, isn't it? I'm already ripping him off.
He's using that example exactly of the clock and how, obviously we perceive everything at the same time and we live through what the past has just been. But obviously on the clock, it's all this kind of separate structure.
So I was trying to understand duration then. I was thinking of clock time as a snapshot of a clock face telling one moment in time. So let's say we move from photographs to film. Fine. Say you film a clock for a 24-hour cycle. But of course, the frames in a standard film move on from all those points, all those markers. They go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. So I suppose to understand duration a bit more would be that you'd have to have every single frame of the film visible at the same time. Is that closer, do you think, possibly to duration?
Yeah, so he uses the example of the melody, music. He says that music is really the example of interpenetrative durée and the interconnectedness of our subjective experience. We remember instantly what just happened. A melody is that collective whole that is also full of differences and full of changes. So that is at the heart of our subjective experience of time, the fact that it's a continuous change, constantly changing, but at the same time keeping something there, a link throughout that is the same.
And our perception would be the past that we've known, the present that's probably now already the past.
Exactly, he says it's always...
future.
Yeah, that we're always... So his focus after in Meta and Memory is really to say that we're always looking ahead. We are creatures of habit and we need to obviously go towards the future of action constantly. And so we use that past to move into the future always. And so that's why, the present is always already past and we're always moving into that future through durée. Something that is useful. So he does say that memories are kept and retained to be useful. Yeah.
So duration then is all these states that are merging. So the melody is an interesting idea though, because it made me think that of course then, is it the case that these individual states, though, they're not all equal? In the way that we recall memories, they're not of equal importance. So for a melody to not become just a build-up of continuous noise with every note carrying on and sustaining, they have to actually fade, they have to decay, they have to fade into the background, don't they?
Yeah, that is really, I think you're really giving a good example there of what he's trying to say. It's this continuous recreation in a way, something that's recreated in every moment of things that are less important and then become important again when we recall them, in a sense.
Also, he's fully aware of the fallibility in the way that Dickens is of memory. Am I getting this right? Quantitative and qualitative time. Would you be able to have a little... Sorry to throw these things at you.
No.
Have a little, because we will move on to the Dickens books and the stories and everything, I think, but just to get this little foundational understanding would be great.
So the quantitative is the kind of measured chronological time or mathematical time. So you could say just mathematical and then the subjective in a way as well. So quantitative is more of the measuring and the quantifiable, something that's more a scientific way of measuring things, mathematical. And then the qualitative is this subjective, internally perceived, internally felt experience. So anything that happens within.
I got thinking about A Tale of Two Cities. And I just wondered what you thought of this. Just on that quantitative and qualitative, there's this moment, where Sidney Carton is going to the guillotine in the tumbrils, and the knitting women are counting the numbers. And there's this most extraordinary moment. I'm sure you know where it goes something like crash, a head is held up, and the knitting women who scarcely lifted their eyes to look at it a moment ago when it could think and speak, count one.
Wow.
I mean, I thought that really, and it came to me as I was reading your thesis. I just thought, oh gosh, I just really remember that line about, that's a quantitative view of time and the world and existence.
Yeah.
And, you know, that a person has just been killed and you're just counting them off as a number at the point of their death.
And that contrast there that Dickens is underlining, the complete lack of empathy, or the lack of it just reminds me of Hard Times, obviously, as well. The idea of just measuring and counting things, and obviously Dickens is always talking about that, isn't he, about the importance of feeling things internally rather than counting and measuring things that obviously don't have that significance and that meaning if you just count them. So that's exactly what Bergson is saying is the problem with the way that we talk about time, or that we so that's really interesting. I need to go back to
but also you know, the other thing is, just going a little further on from that, is Sydney Carton with the seamstress, and she's saying, when I die, is it going to be long before I'm reunited with my sister? And he says something like, there is no time there and no trouble there. So it's like Carton has got himself into a place of duration. Is that too much of a stretch, do you think? Because he's not...
No, that's really interesting.
He's not in the world of that violence. He's not in the violence that's about to be done to him. He's beyond it, and he's looking into the future of what he's done for Lucy and Darnay and their family and all of that.
Taking a step back from that real world or external view, and thinking more about his inner experience.
There we go. Well, anyway, I just wanted to share.
That's really makes me want to read A Tale of Two Cities again now.
Oh, it's just astonishingly good, isn't it? I mean, the echoing footsteps in there as well, and premonition and foreshadowing and all those things. I'm going to let you lead on the Dickens now properly, though, because could we go possibly? I know this is a non-linear concept, but we could go a little bit in order through what you've chosen.
Yeah, we need linearity. We need chronology.
And Bergson agrees with that as well, doesn't he? It's
definitely.
It's really important to. I had to remind myself of that, but I think it's a product of our time now, isn't it? That we have such polarized thought that we're so ready to think, oh, this person stands for this, in total opposition of that.
That's true. And that is the essence of his philosophy. That isn't just one thing. Nothing is just static. Nothing is this static thing. It's always in movement and always heterogeneous, rather than something that's just one plane. And
if anything, he's trying to restore balance in some way, because we've gone too far one way in our minds with calculating and measuring and
so Dickens, I started talking about A Christmas Carol, obviously, with Scrooge, and when I looked back, because obviously A Christmas Carol for me was something that, you know, at first you think that you know that story so well, and but then when you really start thinking about it through this lens, and the fact that Scrooge uses this ruler to try and terrify people, and I was just thinking, even the objects that he picks up are literally objects that measure things and calculate, obviously, and quantify how much money he has, or all these things that obviously Dickens is pointing at too. So that's something else, obviously, in the external world that you can see is already pointing to what Dickens is saying about his inner life or his mind. So that's something that I thought was really interesting. And then obviously when you go back to his past and you see all these images of the past, it's very visual, and I think, people have said before that it's very cinematic, and the way that he describes it's so forward-thinking when you think how he describes the hovering above the past and the images of his childhood. And these memory images are what Bergson calls memory images, because they are conjured up from the past, because they are useful in the present, and because they will have an impact with each new perception in the present. And that's what really made me thinking about all these images, and how then it has an effect on the ongoing experience of time. And then also forward thinking, because Bergson says, we need to think about our actions and we need to always think ahead. And when he looks into the future, and even the way the spirits are described as well, obviously so interesting, and there's just so much to say, even those little passages when he describes the ghost of Christmas past that is almost, even just that character.
It's amazing, isn't it? It's almost like you're looking down a time corridor, aren't you? Because you're seeing a child that's an old man, and then a child again.
It was a strange figure, like a child, yet not so like a child as like an old man. Its hair, which hung about its neck and down its back, was white, as if with age, and yet the face had not a wrinkle in it, and the tenderest bloom was on the skin. The figure itself fluctuated in its distinctness, being now a thing with one arm, now with one leg, now with 20 legs, now a pair of legs without a head, now a head without a body, of which dissolving parts no outline would be visible in the dense gloom wherein they melted away.
All the limbs multiplying and then disappearing again. It's so
and
powerful.
The light that cannot be extinguished as well, and the idea of, because when you look at Bergson's language as well, the way he uses language, he often uses that word of extinguished, and Dickens also uses that to talk about the past and memories that really can't be extinguished, and that's the point, isn't it? Is that it's always there. At the level of the sentence itself, you just see the impact already of memory.
Yeah, and another moment in your thesis, which you include, which I love this bit so much, the start of Stave 2, where Marley is visited and Scrooge wakes up, but he wakes up out of time.
Yeah.
"Why, it isn't possible," said Scrooge, "that I can have slept through a whole day and far into another night. It isn't possible that anything has happened to the sun, and this is 12 at noon." The idea being an alarming one, he scrambled out of bed and groped his way to the window. All he could make out was that it was very foggy and extremely cold, and that there was no noise of people running to and fro and making a great stir, as there unquestionably would have been if night had beaten off bright day and taken possession of the world.
Yeah, it's this in-between world in a way. That in-between, obviously, dreams, reality. He doesn't know what time it is. He doesn't really know what's going to happen next, what just happened, if it's real. And this kind of world of spirits and shadows is really what I think allows Dickens to use that idea of the subjective, the past influencing the present. There's something that we can't see, that we can't grasp.
And I suppose how time is felt as well comes in a lot, doesn't it? You know, we all know that feeling of something taking ages. You're waiting for something and it's stressful, and that takes ages, whereas some pleasurable time can just fly by, can't it? And you just...
Time flies.
Exactly, time flies. The occasions when Scrooge listens for the strike and then nothing happens. He goes, oh, well...
Yeah.
And of course, and other times he feels like he's been asleep longer than he has, and all of that.
It's completely distorted, his perception of time. Yeah.
And that pulls him, being pulled away from the clock time of the world, draws him nearer to himself again. He finds himself.
Trying to, and that desire to always try and find that reliable marker of time, that is, again, something that obviously in Dickens' world, the clocks suddenly were everywhere, and that awareness of something that's reliable was in a way reassuring. Yeah,
absolutely. And I feel like, and I've taken this quote from you, this Proust quote about railways.
Yeah.
Making society suddenly having to think about minutes.
Yeah.
In order to catch a train.
Railway time itself as a concept. Right. Yeah. And having to think about those specific timetables that suddenly appeared, that people wouldn't be thinking about before that.
Whereas beforehand, pre-industrial times, you might have just listened for the quarter.
Yeah. Or the church.
Or the church. Yeah, exactly. And you go, oh, the sun's up now.
Yeah.
Oh, the sun's up. It must be time for work. Yeah. Or it's going down. Yeah, absolutely. So it has all of that. It brings so much opportunity and then at the same time, stress.
Yeah.
And free will is important, isn't it? Free will is clearly laid out in this story. Dickens is a believer in it, isn't he? And is Bergson, if I got that right, Bergson.
Yeah, definitely, yeah. He says that you are truly within durée if you realize that the past is always no more, and that your you have to take action, and so that action is your decision, and it's always informed by the past, but also constantly moving towards the future, and at the center of that is our own free will and our actions, obviously, that make a difference each passing moment. So definitely that goes with Dickens and what he says, we are all Scrooge in a way, and we all need to realize that our actions have consequences, and he made that chain. I can't remember exactly how he says that. Yeah, it's a chain that he made himself.
Link by link, yard by yarn.
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly.
And that chain is a recurring theme for Dickens, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
With Great Expectations.
It is the same with any life. Imagine one selected day struck out of it, and think how different its course would have been. Pause, you who read this, and think for a moment of the long chain of iron or gold, of thorns or flowers, that would never have bound you, but for the formation of the first link on one memorable day.
And free will and Bergson is standing in opposition to some of the people that come after him in that sort of very brutal 20th century, slightly more nihilistic look at things,
Definitely.
where you think like, you don't have any control over your destiny. But he truly believes that we're not just the effect of a cause. We can be the cause.
Yeah, he really repositions the
effects.
self and the mind and our consciousness, ourselves. We are in action in the present, and we are in control. Yeah, so definitely he really puts the individual back at the center of everything, really, for our existence, for human existence. Yeah. Rather than what happened before, where people used to, all the philosophies of empiricism and associationist theories as well, thinking about the world having an impact on us rather than this symbiotic double movement that he thinks. Yeah.
So if we move on to your next book, it is The Chimes, isn't it, from 1844? So go on, hit us with The Chimes then.
With The Chimes, I was thinking about, obviously, subjective time and our own feeling of who we are in the world and the relationship between the world and the self that Bergson talks about, and obviously the threat to that subjective self. When you think about Trotty and how he gets caught up in all these newspapers and what other people will say, and this very detached, obviously, description of people and people's lives, and obviously what Dickens wanted to show, the fact that you can't just read a newspaper and understand a person's experience. You can't generalize by just pointing out numbers and, again, numbers and measuring and calculating just people as numbers. And so that really dehumanizing aspect of the society that he was living in, and the difference between that and his connection with his daughter and their own experience, bringing him back to that realization in the end that really that is the most important, is our own experience, rather than trying to fit into these calculations or try and fit in a society that doesn't really understand you.
Yes, and society is is measuring Trotty, isn't it? And bringing up very little, that very Victorian idea of usefulness, a person's usefulness is recurring all the time. And that moment where Alderman Cute starts eating Trotty's lunch of tripe and says to him, "Oh, don't tell me you haven't got enough to eat, because I've just tasted your tripe." And Alderman Cute is taking one lunchtime, one moment in Trotty's life, which is a rare occasion when Meg, his daughter, in celebration, brings him food that he doesn't always get to have. And he's judging
because he
him by
talks
that.
about this. He talks about dinner time. And that specific passage about dinner time, when I read it again, I was thinking, how did I not think about this before when I read it? Because that small passage is so important, saying that for other people, dinner time is just this mundane day-to-day activity. But for him, it has that special significance, obviously, because it's not easily accessible to him.
Dinner time, eh? Repeated Toby, using his right-hand muffler like an infantine boxing glove and punishing his chest for being cold. There's nothing more regular in its coming round than dinner time, and nothing less regular in its coming round than dinner.
And the bells, obviously, the chimes, and the fact that he feels like he is part of The chimes, in a way, is described as part of them, as if he's almost invisible, part of that everyday, regular sound, which is really eerie.
And the melody of those bells.
Yeah.
And how it comforts him and everything. It makes me think of what you were saying about Bergson's image of melody, that even though he's counting time, the melody of those bells, the singing of those bells have something deeper for him, a kind of durational quality to them that lift him out of his mood and make him able to do his work.
Yeah, but he imagines are talking to him and telling him
it's great, isn't it?
What happened?
And then it turns out later on, of course, they are.
They really are in the end.
Yes. Yeah. But so when he's in the bell tower and all of that, what does that? How do you see that moment?
And I can't help when I'm talking to you, when I realize that I'm talking to you about this and watching your performance of the chimes. It was incredible.
Oh, did you see that?
I saw your performance of A Christmas Carol and the chimes, but when I think when I was doing the PhD, it all started when it was the virtual ones through the So that was incredible. But yeah, thinking about that moment with the chimes and that whole idea that the bells have always been there and they've been a part of this material world for such a long time, and they represent this kind of historical past. A connection to our past, which again is so important for our existence. But then the completely different experience of that moment for him, and him being transported and not knowing how much time has passed, and all the goblins and all these creatures that surround him, all these details about how they represent people who have been here but who are not there, and then these spirits that just appear that he can see. And I think it just shows again that sense of an interconnected experience between what he can see and what he can't see, which is the problem, because when he reads these newspapers, he's not actually realizing that this could happen to his own daughter. And that's when it hits him. And the element of spirits and phantoms and things, I mean, they may be faded perhaps because they are from the past or from the future, that they're not, they're in that time. Or something, or something that could have been or that could be. Because that's also such that's such an important aspect, isn't it? You're pointing us towards the haunted man, I feel, already on this. Even with the carol, obviously, what has yet to come, Christmas yet to... And obviously, this is always a part of it. And I think with the haunted man, again, that's a really important part of it, obviously, with the deep, deep gulf. Yes. Where things that might have been or might be are always wandering.
When these shadows brought into the minds of older people other thoughts and showed them different images in the likeness of forms and faces from the past, from the grave, from the deep, deep gulf, where things that might have been and never were are always wandering. It's my favourite quote from The Haunted Man.
I love it. It's
so Dickensian, and I suppose Bergsonian as well. But just before we get into The Haunted Man, there is one thing, though, that comes up in that scene, that same scene with Trotty and the tribe. I don't even remember the sleek-coated gentleman who goes on about the past, and it's all nostalgia. And he rejects the present time. You know, everything's rubbish today. Yeah, but in the good old days, the good old days.
Oh, sighed the red-faced gentleman. The good old times. The good old times. The gentleman didn't specify what particular times he alluded to. What times they were. They were the only times. It's of no use talking about other times. You don't call these times, do you? I don't. No matter what anybody else said, he still went turning round and round in one set form of words, as a poor squirrel turns and turns in its revolving cage.
It's all about balance, isn't it? And the same with Bergson. He compares two different types of people to illustrate that. He says the extremes are the dreamer, who is completely in the past and in that world of pure memory and has no access to the real ongoing present. And then the impulsive man of action, who just always thinks about what's about to happen and action, and who is completely disconnected from the past. So it's really interesting when you think about those examples. And he says that we are always in the middle, really. We are merging the past and the present all the time.
Just talking about the chimes again really quickly, and I don't know if you've ever felt this. I don't know if you have this kind of sentimental side to you at all, but have you ever felt there's something about, there's sadness in the passing of the year?
Yeah.
Where the old year is already treated as dead and gone before it's actually gone. And I don't know why, there's something quite moving about that passage in the chimes. And I remember having feelings like that, you know, when New Year approaches and you have a sense of that year passing. And I know it's just, in a way, we think of it as just a number.
Yeah, that's really interesting when you think about that, because in a way, it's just a chronological marker that we've created.
Artificially put on.
Yeah, completely artificial. But then because we have that, and because we do need that to be in this world of action and structure, so then we do need it. So then it's interesting to see how Dickens plays with the emotions with that. Yeah, definitely. I love that passage.
The old year was already looked upon as dead, and its effects were selling cheap, like some drowned mariners aboard ship. Its patterns were last year's, and going at a sacrifice, before its breath was gone.
And when Trotty's saved at the end and Meg is saved and all of that, the last thing they do is have a big dance, don't they? Where the drum is drunk and the bells are ringing in their own time, and it's all cacophonous, and the dancing is all out of time and all over the place. And there's something about that freewheeling spirit that isn't conforming to what the beat is meant to be.
Yeah,
that's the true freedom there. Yeah. Go for the Haunted Man, Celeste. Hit
the
us with
Haunted
it.
Man. Yeah, I've been really advocating for the Haunted Man in conferences and things because nobody really knew about it. You know, everyone knows the Christmas Carol, and now everybody's telling me, "Oh, I want to read that book. I want to read that story."
Yeah,
so I'm happy.
Absolutely.
Because I think that in-between world again that Dickens creates, between the memories that we have, but also the hopes that we have for the future, and the regrets, but the things that we also wish we could still do, and all that, and the story about our memories that could be erased, and that pact with the devil trope thing, I think is so powerful, and I think it's really surprising that we don't know about the Haunted Man more than we do.
Yeah, so in the Haunted Man, once the gift is bestowed, and Redlaw has had his painful memories taken away, is he left with habit memory? Have I understood what habit memory is correctly?
Yeah, and actually, when you mention this, I now think that is exactly what is happening. So thank you for that, because it's really helping me think about it. Because it's true, the fact that he doesn't have all his memories that are painful or that are difficult for him to remember, then he's left with everything that is just useful in a way, and that is what Bergson says is habit memory. It's that memory that we use every day, and the repetition of what we need to just live, I suppose. So it's anything that's not related to the emotional. So in a way, we could see it as that, because Redlaw just moves through the world in the same way. He hasn't changed who he is. He's still the same, doing the same things. But he doesn't have all the emotional memories that would be the opposite of habit memory. So I think that really works.
Is it the mechanical man again? Is it that what's happening?
Yeah, he becomes the mechanical man in a way. Yeah, definitely.
And so if he hears someone playing the flute, he'll only hear the tapping of the keys.
Exactly.
He doesn't hear the melody. He just hears the mechanics and the workings of things. And to come back to Bergson and melody, I think you know what's coming then for the Haunted Man. There are two key moments, aren't there, for Redlaw and that melody. Could you take us through that?
Yeah, so the fact that he's, in a way, this static, mechanical man, that Bergson would say, because he's decided to forget his past and forget that pain and the sorrow. And then he can't really hear or perceive music in the same way.
He stopped to listen to a plaintive strain of music, but could only hear a tune made manifest to him by the dry mechanism of the instruments and his own ears, with no address to any mystery within him, without a whisper in it of the past or of the future, powerless upon him as the sound of last year's running water, or of the rushing of last year's wind.
it's specifically with music and with the wind and at specific time of day, at night, at twilight, that he has those sorrowful memories. And then when he no longer has them, it's music again that brings him back to time and to memory and to feeling empathy when he hears music in the distance.
The Christmas music that he had heard before began to play. He listened to it at first, as he had listened in the churchyard. But presently, it playing still and being borne towards him on the night air in a low, sweet, melancholy strain, he rose and stood stretching his arms about him, as if there were some friend approaching within his reach. As he did this, his face became less fixed and wandering. A gentle trembling came upon him, and at last his eyes filled with tears.
I think what I've learnt from reading your thesis, one of the things, well, I've actually learned quite a lot, I'll be completely honest, but things I'd never known at all. But one thing that's really struck me is how in plain sight Dickens and concepts of time actually is. I mean, it's everywhere. Once you open your eyes to it, you think, oh my God. You got me thinking about duration actually in relation to the battle of life as well.
Definitely.
The durational quality of that battleground, where the traces of that very bloody battle haunt the characters all the way through. And then the physical traces in the ground of all the weapons and all of that, and the green growing grass where people have died. And
so again, the idea of like memory that's green, that's still there, and what can grow from something that is past.
Just to say about Bergson being aware of the unscientific yet crucial aspect of subjective time, there's this lovely bit at the end of the Battle of Life where the very last paragraph is he mentions time. The narrator says he's talking to Father Time, basically leaning on his scythe. And he says, I have observed that time confuses facts occasionally. I hardly know what weight to give to his authority. Which is so interesting.
So interesting. Yeah. Father Time. And that is another thing, the way that Dickens perceives this personified time figure.
Yeah, it's almost a kind of a slight God type figure, isn't he? Father Time.
All powerful, that controls everything in some way.
And there's a kind of perhaps an imperialism in clock time, isn't there? I mean, I'm personally very glad we have international time zones that are recognized across the world. I mean, it's very handy if you're going to get a flight somewhere.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we are under its yoke a little bit, aren't we? Can I invite you to move on to our next?
Yeah, David Copperfield.
Yeah.
So obviously, and so this is the first one that I ever thought about in relation to all of this. As the first person narrative, as this retrospective Bildungsroman, typical novel that you would think of when you think of time.
Yeah, you just threw that word in there, didn't you? Bildungsroman? Is that what it was? Does that mean linear? Does that mean?
Yeah, so it means that it's those novels that go from childhood to adulthood and follow someone. Yeah. So, but in a way, I would say that it challenges the typical Bildungsroman that you would find in the 19th century, because it's not this linear development narrative that you usually see, obviously, as childhood and then you go into adulthood. Here it's more through that narrative voice. It's something that's rooted in change, but also in the fact that the past is not static. We don't have this archive of memory that's just sitting there and never changes, like a picture book that you could go through. Instead, Bergson says, and I think Dickens really shows in David Copperfield and Great Expectations, is that we constantly recreate our past and our past memories with each new perception and with our experience as we live. It's the same when David thinks about his mother and he sees these images of her and he thinks that she's there in front of him. So we have those very vivid visual images, but obviously those are tainted by the perception that he has in that moment.
Can I say of her face, altered as I have reason to remember it, perished as I know it is, that it is gone, when here it comes before me at this instant, as distinct as any face that I may choose to look on in a crowded street? Can I say of her innocent and girlish beauty that it faded and was no more, when its breath falls on my cheek now, as it fell that night? can I say she ever changed? When my remembrance brings her back to life, thus only.
It's very emotional in a way when you read that and you try and imagine how he wants to, in a way, fix that image of her in his mind. And
So is that an attempt at pure memory? Is that a snapshot memory where you take something that isn't influenced by what's going to come or what happened since? And
so Bergson says that pure memory is all the memories and the images that we have. And they're there, but when we remember them, they then become inevitably tinted by
so it's
the
not that.
now.
Oh, it's the opposite then. So does he describe an opposite of pure memory, or
So he says that the memory that we have that's within the present is what we recreate. So in a way, right now, if you remembered something in your past, you would remember it and straight away it would change. So that's what Bergson says, that as soon as you remember it, it changes and it's tinted by what you are perceiving now, what your perception is now as well.
And what about just thinking about David? What about memories that have been constructed after the event that we have no physical, like David's birth? He talks that first chapters in a lot of detail about how Betsy appears and presses her nose against the glass and what she says to his mum and all of this, and all this amazing stuff. And of course, he was born, but he wasn't. He wasn't born. He wasn't even born in that moment. So it's moments before he's born, and yet he writes it so fulsomely.
Yeah.
Even though he's had to construct it all.
Yeah, I think it goes with the idea that we use these images or these memories that we think we have and sometimes aren't reliable to kind of build this story, of our lives, that we are a story in a way that we recreate constantly. Definitely. And what we've been told, and then it's something that you think you remember or you might not remember, and that's what we see with Dickens as well. Yeah. Bergson also says that in our lives every day, we recreate what we think is the past. We are stories, we are narratives that we create for ourselves. It's very unreliable in a way, what we think of as these past memories. We change them, we mold them, we reconstruct what we think of in that narrative of our life. And read them differently and draw different conclusions from it. Exactly.
Yeah. I'm gonna throw these words out and say them aloud, probably for the first time in my life. The first one I've said before: prolepsis, analepsis, and palimpsest.
Yeah.
Could you break those down for us, because this is fascinating stuff.
So prolepsis is when the narrator clearly shows something that will happen. So a clear revelation of the future that is not yet.
Right.
And then analepsis is the opposite, a past retrospection within the present.
That's flashback, is it? Is that?
Yeah, so retrospection, so thinking about your own past, but in the present.
So you're thinking about your own past, but it doesn't have hindsight attached to it. Is that right?
No.
Is that separate from? Right. That's really interesting, because I just want to quickly sort of mention this, as I've got an episode on George Silverman's explanation coming up, which I've not read and I know nothing about. So I'm only a few pages in, but there's something and I just thought, we've got to talk about this, because I'll just read you a sentence that he says, and he's writing a first person narrative here, and he says, "What do I know now of Hogton Towers? Very little, for I have been gratefully unwilling to disturb my first impressions." And right at the very beginning, he has also got this thing where he says, "I will come upon it by degrees, the natural manner, after all, for God knows that is how it came upon me." So it's so strange. This is in 1868, so this is a while after, David and Pip and the Christmas books. But here he's trying to undo all of that kind of.
That is really interesting.
Yeah, he's trying to. I don't know what you would describe it, but we're in that kind of analepsis place then, of pure flashback with no sense.
Trying to not reflect on that or change what the first impression was. Yeah.
Yeah. Does Bergson have a use for that? Does he think that there are moments of clarity to be got from?
I think he would say that doesn't exist.
Okay.
But obviously, because I think he would say that those images, as soon as you recall them, they're changed and they are inevitably going to be, tinted with your own perception now, and that you can't really help that because of what you've experienced before. Yeah, that's really interesting. Think about when he says that I don't want to, what does he say, disturb? I don't want to disturb those impressions.
Unwilling to disturb my first impressions.
Yeah.
And it's a clever narrative device as well, isn't it? In the same way that it's a clever narrative device to say, oh, well, there was this problem coming, which I'll talk about later. But to also not even mention that there's this problem coming, and then it can be a real shock, can't it? And then you have the palimpsest.
It's seeing what was there before and adding on in a way, because through the pages you would be able to see what was behind. But I think with Bergson you also see something else, that is the fact that each memory, when you remember it, is already changed because of what you're going through now. You are not that person who experienced that memory.
In your David Copperfield examples in the thesis, there's a fantastic passage where David is tormented by the ticking of the clock.
Mm-hmm.
At length, the steady ticking of the undisturbed clock on the wall tormented me to that degree that I resolved to go to bed.
There's that very powerful quote as well from Betsy Trotwood, which you use, and it's also on the beginning of Demon Copperhead as well. Is it?
It's in a vain trot to recall the past, unless it works some influence upon the present. And that is exactly what Bergson says that memories do. But it's interesting, obviously, because it is Miss Betsy, and we know that in the past, she doesn't have a really good relationship with her past.
No, because of that chapter 1 where you see in her face the past wrongs working within her.
Yeah, and her problem with men.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so, but for Betsy, don't think about anything that brings you sorrow. So maybe like a red law.
A little bit more red law, yeah.
Yeah.
But it's also, you can avoid nostalgia, dangerous nostalgia perhaps, if you apply the past to the present time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think there's culture wars and all sorts of things happening because people are unwilling to connect the past with the present. They just want to go back to the past and have that pure past that doesn't want those difficult conversations.
Yeah. So in a way, it is also a good piece of advice that she gives there. So it's very ambiguous because you can see it in both ways.
Yeah. Miss Havisham.
She's the one who doesn't want to move forward and doesn't want to go through change and is in that static past, really, that cannot move forward. Then even Satie's house, obviously, with the clocks that have stopped at 20 to 9, and the wedding table and the wedding dress and all those descriptions and the spider webs and all of that. When you go into the details, so interesting to think about.
Well, yes, it just got me thinking that if you try and capture a single moment in time and you cling to it and won't, with all the force of your existence, try and not to move on from it, that moment that you're forcing yourself to stay in moulders, doesn't it? And decays and festers and grows very, very horrible.
Who is it? Said the lady at the table. Pip, ma'am. Come nearer. Let me look at you. Come close. It was when I stood before her, avoiding her eyes, that I took note of the surrounding objects in detail and saw that her watch had stopped at 20 minutes to 9 and that a clock in the room had stopped at 20 minutes to 9. Do you know what I touch here? She said, laying her hands one upon the other on her left side. Yes, ma'am. What do I touch? Your heart. Broken.
It just made me think that the fact that you said that, it just makes me think that in a way, even though she seems like she is stuck in that past and in a static past, but at the same time it does change and it does, like you say, become worse and become more and more painful because of that. Change is always there, even when you try to resist.
Yeah, no, and it got me thinking, just from what you're saying, that Redlaw is trying to destroy the past. Miss Havisham's trying to destroy the future. Something I've written down, intuition, is that correct?
Yeah.
So there's something, when Bergson is discredited a little bit by other philosophers, because there's a potential bit of misogyny there with the idea that Well, basically, machines and measuring instruments are manly, and emotions and feelings are womanish.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Maths are very
Maths is
very
manly.
reliable.
Yes.
Very scientific, but anything else is not true. Yeah. And again, it's because he was criticized as being very like a mystical philosopher in some way, just because you couldn't root his thinking in a scientific method. Or scientific experiment that you can see. And of course, that's because it is metaphysical. It's the metaphysics of time and subjective experience. And so he really wants to reconcile philosophy and science and say, we don't have to separate them. They can work together. Life is not just science.
The authentic self.
Oh, yeah.
That's Bergson's description again, isn't it? That's right, isn't he?
Yeah, the fundamental or authentic, because obviously it's translation from the French, but he says le moi fondamental, so it's fundamental or the true, authentic self. Yeah.
So there's the moment, and you've mentioned that laughter is often a way that we return to our authentic selves, and but there's also the tears as well, and that moment, that stunning moment where Pip leaves. He's got his new clothes and he leaves Joe and Biddy, and it's all very stiff and formal and awkward. And then he has, I think, the mists rise as he gets to the turnstile, and then
it was a hurried breakfast with no taste in it. I got up from the meal, saying with a sort of briskness, as if it had only just occurred to me, "Well, I suppose I must be off," and then kissed my sister, who was laughing and nodding and shaking in her usual chair, and kissed Biddy and threw my arms around Joe's neck. Then I took up my little portmanteau and walked out. The last I saw of them was when I presently heard a scuffle behind me and, looking back, saw Joe throwing an old shoe after me and Biddy throwing another old shoe. I stopped then to wave my hat, and dear old Joe waved his strong right arm above his head, crying huskily, "Hurrah!" and Biddy put her apron to her face. I walked away at a good pace, thinking it was easier to go than I had supposed it would be, and reflecting that it would never have done to have an old shoe thrown after the coach in sight of all the High Street. I whistled and made nothing of going. But the village was very peaceful and quiet, and the light mists were solemnly rising, as if to show me the world. And I had been so innocent and little there, and all beyond was so unknown and great, that in a moment, with a strong heave and sob, I broke into tears. It was by the finger-post at the end of the village, and I laid my hand upon it and said, "Goodbye, oh, my dear, dear friend." Heaven knows we need never be ashamed of our tears, for they are rain upon the blinding dust of earth, overlying our hard hearts. I was better after I had cried than before, more sorry, more aware of my own ingratitude, more gentle.
What are your reflections on that?
Yeah, I think if we think about the idea of the authentic self, it is that example of him maybe thinking about what this place represents, what these people represent to him, and who he really is, really, because this person that he's trying to be, this is not really who he is. And maybe that's one little glimpse of him actually feeling his emotions and maybe reconnecting with who he actually is. He's thinking about what he's leaving behind. And in a way, it's really sad. Maybe he's thinking that he's going to change that and abandon who he really is. I mean, so it's really heartbreaking.
It is incredibly heartbreaking, isn't it? And I sort of feel in that moment the reader is wanting him to turn back, go back and say goodbye properly, so that they both know how much you value them and love them.
Yeah, carrying this pretense of trying to be the gentleman, and
he gets a second chance, doesn't he, in London when Joe comes to visit him in London, and then and it's awkward, and Joe leaves, and then and a moment later he goes out to try and find him in the street, but he can't, so he misses it again.
Because the authentic self is the opposite of that superficial self that we were talking about when we were talking about language. can really see that as well in the way that Pip obviously is going to try and speak in a certain way and use these kind of social requirements to then be another person to meet these social needs. And so that is the opposite of the real, true self.
And it's interesting because you have Herbert there as a mirror to show him what a real gentleman is, someone who actually, is intelligent and lives a certain way, speaks a certain way, and has certain outlooks on life, but is very kind and humane and welcomes Magwitch into the house with no problem. It occurred to me since reading your thesis that when Joe goes and looks after Pip when Pip is ill, and again, Pip's illness actually also brings him back to his true self, doesn't it? I'm getting into a very dangerous situation with his health. And Joe says that thing to him.
Dear old Pip, old chap, you and me was ever friends.
It's an interesting thing the way Joe says that, because he says was ever friends. So is Joe caring for Pip because of the friends that they were? Or is he saying we will always be friends? And then Joe will then go and distance himself again and let Pip carry on living his life. It's so...
Yeah. It's that sense of, continuity between what was and what is. And maybe it's reassuring to say that, we were always close and I will still be there for you, even if you are trying to push me away in some way. Maybe that reassuring sense of, something that's always been there and always be there.
Yeah, but Joe is only an authentic self, isn't he?
Completely.
And when he has to dress up in Sunday clothes and things like that, he looks awful and feels awful. And that thing about he says to Pip about how he wants to be right, and he's not right in London. It's not his place. It's not his. These aren't his people.
He doesn't know how to pretend to be someone else. He's just himself.
But his unconditional love for Pip, in that he is prepared to do everything he can to help Pip live his dreams and support it. That
goes back, I think, to another point that you were going to talk about, the idea that Joe is actually very connected to his past and his childhood. Compared to Pip.
Because he sheds real tears remembering talking about his father. He's back in that moment, isn't he? Recalling it. Yeah, he's very connected to all of that. Something else that comes up is the idea, and it's not to do with time, but it's to do with laughter.
Yeah.
And how laughter... What's his idea about that brings us back to our truer selves?
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. Actually, this is a complete side note to this, but Monty Python, they were inspired by Bergson and his theory of laughter and comedy and the fact that it brings us back to ourselves, because he talks about a few things in that book, Laughter, Le Rire, where he talks about comedy and the fact that, yes, the mechanical man, that's where it comes from. The idea that when we are rigid and mechanical, and that we don't realize something, or if we are unaware of ourselves, then that's when the ridicule or the comic will be most effective and will be then punished with laughter in a way. That's what he says, that laughter is a punishment.
I find it hard to imagine laughter as punishment until I think of certain social situations, and it can be at school, can't it? In a classroom or something, or in an assembly where you're not supposed to laugh, but something funny's happened and you're trying really hard not to laugh. It's pulling you away from your social identity and all of that. And I think that makes total sense.
Yeah, and he talks about the fact that it brings us all together as well, and that laughter is, something that's social, and obviously, so that goes with what you're saying. If someone starts laughing and then you can't stop, and then someone else feels like they want to laugh as well.
It is a fair, even-handed, noble adjustment of things, that while there is infection in disease and sorrow, there is nothing in the world so irresistibly contagious as laughter and good humour.
But he also, a large part of that book that I was interested in is how he talks about language. And I think this is so interesting to anyone who thinks about fiction and language and just how we use language, and even every day. He says that language is in a way limiting, because obviously it's a social tool that we use to communicate with the world outside. And so because of that, we need to use something that is universally understood. We are inevitably going to be distanced from our own inner self and our own inner reality, how our real emotions are to us and how they feel to us internally. There is a barrier between language and that. And it's really incredible. I actually wrote it down because I thought it's just so great to think about this. And if he met, or if Dickens and him could have talked about that, because I'm always thinking about that. That's my
imagining
PhD.
their meeting. Yeah.
He says that language is obviously, it creates this superficial self that is trying to use language to obviously be a part of this social world, which we need to be, and we need language, and it is very useful, and we do need to have it. But then it limits our interconnected, subjective inner life when we want to translate how it really is to feel these emotions. But he says that the novelists, or sometimes the artists, the painters, the musicians, are able to translate that through art, and that's what I think is such a powerful passage. And he says that we estimate the talent of a novelist by the power with which they lift out of the common domain, to which language had thus brought them down, feelings and ideas to which they try to restore by adding detail to detail, their original and living individuality. So the idea that sometimes the novelist, and we judge the quality of a novelist by this ability to translate our lived inner experience. And when I was reading that, I was thinking that is exactly what I feel Dickens does. So I think that Bergson would agree.
Absolutely. Because it is a paradox, isn't it? Because language on a page, they're markers, they're empirical markers, and in a sense, they're far away from what they're conjuring. They couldn't be further, in a sense. Yeah. Made me think, I don't know how well you know Lord of the Rings, but it made me think of the Ents.
Yeah.
And I think it's Treebeard at one point who asks one of the hobbits, what do you call this? And I think it's a hill.
Yeah.
And he says, well, that's a very hasty word, hill, for something that's stood there for centuries.
Yeah.
And I just thought that's very profound somehow.
Yeah.
That you see, that word hill does nothing to tell us really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
By itself, without our involvement in it, without our investing something in it.
Exactly.
Does Bergson mention our heartbeats? Because he's talking, I only say this because, he's talking about the true self and the subconscious and the emotions and everything. And of course, all of that is underpinned by a regular ticking clock
true,
in our
and
body.
our emotions are connected to our heartbeat,
and if we don't have a heartbeat, if that stops, we have problems,
I don't think he mentioned specifically the heartbeat, which, when you think, which Dickens does think about with time.
Yeah, no, I just wondered that.
Yeah.
I just wondered that. Are you a believer in Bergson's philosophy yourself? Do you?
Yeah, I think definitely. I think it's a
supreme. Well done if you're not, because that was a supreme effort. Right,
yeah, imagine if I was trying to convince other people.
Yeah.
No, definitely. I think there are obviously some things now that are, and I think that's another point that is so interesting. At time, obviously, you could think about it in so many different ways, and now neuroscience of time. I mentioned Your Brain is a Time Machine by Dean Bonomano. I really recommend if you're interested in our experience of time, because now I think there's just so much more. So I think that I would love, to see Bergson now, like thinking about all these things and with the new developments with neuroscience, because it's really coming from that. Because what he says in Your Brain is a Time Machine, talking about the neuroscience aspect, is that we are stories and that our brain is effectively a time machine, because we are constantly thinking about the past and the future, and that is rooted in evolution. We needed to start thinking subjectively about what's going to happen next, to build tools, to start agriculture, all these things for survival and for... So I think that aspect is really interesting, how Bergson is still so relevant today, even now in our own new research. So definitely, I think it would be such an interesting conversation if Dickens and Bergson could appear right now. Yeah.
Wow. Thank you so much, Céleste.
Thank you.
This has been wonderful.
It was wonderful to speak to you.
Bye for now.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you for listening to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire. If you're enjoying these episodes and would like to make a small donation towards the costs of producing them, please follow the link at the bottom of the description and you can make a donation there. Every coffee you buy makes a huge difference. Thank you ever so much. and see you next time.